Perhaps one of the most controversial issues in Canada today is MAID, or medical assistance in dying. There are people who feel that it's being offered too readily in cases where death may not be an appropriate course, and others who feel there needs to be expanded access. One province has decided that the pace of these deaths has gone too far, too fast. I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is 10-3. National Post politics reporter Rahim Mohamed joins me to discuss where MAID is currently at in Canada, why Alberta felt it needed to bring in restrictions, and how those limitations have been perceived. Don't forget, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music. I'd love it if you could leave us a rating, a review, and tell your friends about the show. So, Rahim, the notion of medical assistance in dying has hit the news again recently due to new legislation that was announced in Alberta. And I do want to talk about Alberta in a moment. But first, I feel like it would be beneficial for listeners to break down, for those who may not be familiar with the basic terms, what is medical assistance in dying and what does current federal legislation allow for?
Sure. So there's a long-running right to die movement in this country. I can't get too much into here on this podcast, but suffice it to say, in 2015, actually, toward the tail end of the Harper years, you had a group of folks, I think, suffering from the sorts of terminal illnesses a lot of people would associate, kind of the right to die with, that went to the Supreme Court. So two plaintiffs. One was suffering from ALS, which is a very brutal and debilitating disease that shuts off your extremities and then your limbs and then basic functions like chewing and ultimately breathing. And another individual had spinal stenosis, which creates compression on the spine and greatly limits mobility, creates chronic pain. So these individuals, they went forward to the Supreme Court of Canada and argued for a right to die, a right that was unanimously granted by the Supreme Court in a unanimous decision. This was February of 2015, toward the end of the Harper years, as I mentioned. They gave the federal government some time to update the relevant criminal law, and to do so accordingly. So that is where you get what we call Track One MAID, which comes out of Bill C-14 in June of 2016. So this is, I think, when we think of right to die, when we think of terminal illnesses that result in a right to die, this is where a lot of us will start. So you have this constrained path under federal criminal law, were made, which is effectively kind of a positive medical intervention. So let's think of it as a sedative injection followed by a lethal injection. So where these medical procedures were legalized, but they were done so under tight parameters, in which an individual would have to put forward a grievous and irremediable condition. So something like ALS is what would come to mind for a lot of folks. Where a natural death was, and this is a term that's opened something of a Pandora's box since then, but where a natural death was reasonably foreseeable. So, let's start with what we call Track One MAID, 2016. You have medically assisted, practitioner assisted suicide, made legal, made accessible, but only in these narrow parameters.
Yeah, and you talk about Track 2 MAID and you talk about terminal illnesses, and I think that that's what a lot of people thought MAID would be when it was brought in, and now there's this idea of Track 2 and changes coming to federal legislation. What does that look like, and who would that apply to?
Sure. So the next chapter in this story comes in 2019, when two individuals with serious but non-terminal conditions. So one of them has cerebral palsy, The other has post polio syndrome. So, these are serious conditions. These are conditions that affect your quality of life, but arguably not quite in the same league as something like ALS or late stage cancer. These individuals argue to a court in Quebec that the reasonably foreseeable the reasonably foreseeable condition, which we have, kind of constraining track one MAID, that condition of a reasonably foreseeable death, within a short term period of time, that actually violates their right to die, given that they have conditions that are going to have permanent effects on their quality of life, going to lead to permanent chronic issues and chronic pain. And the judge in this case agrees with him. The judge agrees that mandating that death from the ailment leading to MAID be reasonably foreseeable. The judge in this case says that's a violation of the charter right to life, liberty, and security of person. Interestingly enough, here's where the federal government could appeal the case. This is a Superior Court decision written by a single judge in Quebec. The federal government could appeal. Instead, it decides to accede to the decision, and it decides to create a subsequent uh, category of MAID called Track 2. And that's something that comes out of a piece of legislation in 2021. So that's where you get this second category of MAID, where death is not imminently foreseeable. It's not a terminal condition, but there is a agreement that, to a large part, conditions involved are untradeable. The term that's used is irremediable. That there aren't medical interventions that can significantly improve the quality of life for individuals that are suffering from these sorts of diseases. So there's where you have a second track of MAID opened up, and that begins in March of 2021 with Bill C7. This is where we are in Canada today. Although I should stress that about 95% of cases that involve MAID involve type 1 MAID. Track 1 MAID. So track 2 MAID is still relatively rare, but I think it's where a lot of folks would raise moral objections. And I think this is where we have a much more complicated conversation surrounding MAID, particularly with, okay, if we look at the parameters that are set out by the judge in Quebec, there's nothing to preclude mental disorders that are deemed untreatable and irremediable. So that is something that's not precluded in the decision in Quebec. But I think it's something that a lot of us have a moral or ethical issue with. If someone has major depression, if someone has PTSD, we feel like there's a duty to help that individual save their life, to put that individual on a more positive path forward. But there's nothing in the decision in Quebec that would substantiate that view, and there's nothing that would differentiate, these sort of quote unquote untreatable mental illnesses from other untreatable diseases. So we're now at a situation where the federal government has kicked the can down on the road on mental illness as a sole condition for MAID a few times, and the looming deadline is February 17th of next year. After that date passes, individuals that have mental illnesses that are deemed untreatable, those individuals not having any physical comorbidities will be able to pursue MAID. And I think that for a lot of people is a tripwire.
Yeah, and as I mentioned, I think that there's a lot of consensus in Canada, at least if you look at the polls, that for people who have a terminal diagnosis or a very severe condition, that being able to decide how they want to end their lives should be a freedom that they have. But there's been controversy around the legislation, especially around the discussion around track 2. I know there's been cases where people have complained that they were offered MAID at hospital when they didn't want, that wasn't a part of their thinking or a part of their discussion. And there was even a case of someone who was shopping around for MAID after being denied in one jurisdiction. Can you break down where some of these controversies are coming from?
Sure. So for a lot of us, the case of 26-year-old Keanu Vifayan of Ontario is a really distressing and concerning one. So this young man dealt with mental health issues, as well as physical disabilities stemming from diabetes. So he had blindness and chronic pain that stemmed from his diabetes. If you listen to members of his family, his moods would go up and down. And when he got into these major depressive episodes, he would become obsessed with obtaining MAID. And it was actually these episodes tended to coincide with the winter. When it got cold out, his physical symptoms were exacerbated. He described it, it felt like his extremities were on fire when it got colder out. So this individual um, attempted to obtain authorization for MAID from a number of physicians in Ontario, was unsuccessful in doing so, and then finally in December of last year, obtained the sign off from a physician in British Columbia who's gained some sort of notoriety for prescribing these sorts of course for signing off on MAID. So this is an individual that, by her own count, has signed off on hundreds of applications for MAID and administered MAID hundreds of times. So, this for a lot of people, the young man, whose family insisted that, at times he would be more optimistic about his condition than others, who at his lowest point was able to obtain um, kind of life-ending interventions in British Columbia outside of his home province. For a lot of folks, this case exemplifies, I think, a lack of guardrails or maybe gaps in the system where this young man should have been saved and should have been helped along where he wasn't.
We'll be right back. And now that brings us to Alberta. As it feels like some of these controversies have been key to what Premier Danielle Smith announced recently. And can you walk us through what measures the province is looking at under newly tabled legislation?
Sure. So Alberta signaled for some time that it is going to be putting forward provincial measures to regulate how MAID is administered in the province. So MAID is sort of a weird area of policy in that it concurrently engages criminal law, but it's also a health procedure. And provinces, per their constitutional competencies, have control over the delivery of healthcare. So Alberta last week put forward a long-awaited piece of legislation respecting MAID, and they've signaled that not only are they going to preemptively ban MAID in situations where mental illness is a sole underlying condition. Remember, the clock is ticking on that federal exemption. It's set to expire in just under a year, assuming that it doesn't get further delayed. So not only do they take that step, but they essentially turn back the clock on all of track two. So essentially, Alberta, with this legislation, which goes a lot further than I think a lot of folks were expecting, it turns the clock back to 2016, when kind of the only conditions that would qualify for MAID would be these sorts of terminal illnesses that would have clear physical manifestations, that would not have any effective course of treatment, and where someone's natural death is reasonably foreseeable. In fact, Alberta goes a good deal further. than the federal government did in 2016, in that they don't just nebulously define reasonably foreseeable, they put a date on it. So going forward, assuming this piece of legislation passes, individuals qualifying for MAID will need to demonstrate that they have an ailment that sort of barring MAID would lead to a natural death within 12 months. So not only did they revert to reasonably foreseeable to that criteria, but they put a specific time horizon on that criteria, which the federal government and the House of Commons in Canada never did.
Hmm. And I know that the premier was asked about this during the announcement, and the idea that despite what the province is doing, according to its own survey results on the issue, a plurality, not quite a majority, but more people disagreed with the government implementing more safeguards compared with those who agreed with more safeguards. Um, did the premier get into the reasoning as to why they wanted to go against what the public seems to want in this case, or even just its motivation with bringing forward the legislation?
She did. So she and her attorney general, Mickey Amory, briefed reporters on the bill last week. They brought along a physician who's engaged in these sorts of issues. And the physician's rationale is, when you poll folks just kind of at face value. You pull folks, uh, kind of without them having any sort of education or having read to any extent into the issue. They might be surprised by some of the real life implications of policies that they support in the abstract. So the physician actually said, when we poll these folks in the abstract about things like advanced directives for MAID, about things like track two for MAID, they tend to answer in the affirmative. But if we give them specific cases, if we put forward the case of someone like Keanu Visfafan, and we ask them, should the physician have administered MAID or not, they'll tend to answer in the negative. So, kind of the answer here is this is a conversation that hasn't been properly initiated with the public. We've seen, I guess, from limited research, that when folks are fully engaged, when folks are made aware of some of these more problematic cases and some individuals that fall through the cracks, um, they become much more hesitant to support MAID with a lack of robust guardrails than maybe they would in the abstract.
As with a lot of things that the Alberta premier does these days, there was a lot of controversy around this bill. The reaction, though, I know is mixed. I know, as you mentioned, there are some doctors who work in the field who are in support of this legislation. I know the province had a list of experts that could speak to a position in favor of some of these restrictions. I also know that disability and inclusion advocates were in favor of some aspects of this bill, but I also have seen commentary from people who have had loved ones go through MAID speaking out against this bill. What's the general tenor of either the support or the opposition to this legislation?
So it comes at a time when Canada is getting a lot of attention globally for MAID. And I would say most of that attention is negative. So, quite literally, the day before this bill was introduced, you had MAID come up in a debate in Scotland about their assisted dying bill. And MAID
Mm-hmm.
came up as a cautionary tale of kind of what happens when you get to the bottom of a slippery slope. And that assisted dying bill was ultimately defeated. If you kind of go back and listen to the Joe Rogan podcast with Pierre Poilievre, one of the first things Joe Rogan wants to talk about is, hey, dude, I heard 1 in 20 Canadians are dying from MAID. What's up with this man? So I think, the Alberta government has sort of correctly caught a international wave of skepticism, which by toward Canada, which by some measures is the country that's taken to euthanasia and the country where euthanasia has grown more than any country in the world. I think she's harnessed the skepticism, and she's been able to apply that to the bill. And the pushback from the bill that you've seen has been muted. Even the federal government, so even when I engaged the federal government here in Ottawa last week, a few of the other reporters in our newsroom, tried to scrum the Minister of Justice, the Minister of Health. They don't seem to want to stick their nose in. I think they understand that MAID is something that's become radioactive. It's something that is negatively affecting Canada's reputation globally. Kind of what I got from federal folks, federal officials here in Ottawa was, provinces control the delivery of healthcare in Canada. Provinces can create their own policies surrounding the local delivery of MAID. It was much less pushback or even skepticism, or even, we're closely monitoring the situation than I would have expected. And it seems like the federal government at this point wants to wash its hands of some of the more negative perceptions we're getting of MAID, not just here in Canada, but globally.
How does Alberta compare to other provinces looking at taking a similar tack, or on the flip side, are there other provinces moving in the other direction and wanting to make the program more available? Like, where does Alberta stand with the rest of its counterparts?
Sure. There are two provinces in Canada that have really asserted their provincial domain over MAID, their provincial domain over healthcare. You'll be shocked to hear who the other one is. The other one's Quebec. So kind of this is a story of kind of where you have Alberta and Quebec a lot of the time. I think of the 10 Canadian provinces and 3 territories, it's Quebec and Alberta that tend to assert their provincial powers the most. This is no exception. What's interesting is that Quebec, where MAID is much more popular, whereby some measures and some estimates, you have the highest rate of euthanasia, or one of the highest rates of euthanasia anywhere in the world. The Quebec government actually has put forward legislation to make MAID more accessible. So one thing that they did in the fall of 2024 is they rolled out advanced directives. So in Quebec, if you have a degenerative cognitive condition where your death is not reasonably foreseeable, but the deterioration of your mental faculties and your ability to express consent, if there's a foreseeable decline and there's a foreseeable endpoint to that, you can now in advance say, kind of, while I have my faculties, while I have my ability to make decisions for myself, if my condition gets to this phase, I would like to elect for MAID. So if you're someone who was just diagnosed with Alzheimer's, you can fill out an advance request form that says, hey, when I can no longer recognize my family and friends, when I'm no longer able to bathe and feed and clean myself, that's when I want to receive MAID. So Quebec, you can not only sort of get MAID kind of in the moment, when you've reached a point of no return, but you can request it years ahead of time in anticipation of that point. So Quebec is the other province that's asserted power over MAID, and interestingly enough, they've gone in a much different direction than Alberta.
Now, I am curious about that, because that was some advanced directives or advanced requests came up in the Alberta legislation. I understand Quebec and Alberta are often on different sides of issues, while also similarly exerting their provincial jurisdiction. But why is Alberta taking the opposite tack on advanced requests? Just, for, as you mentioned, when you talk about some of this polling, and the doctor addressed it, that in the abstract, it sounds like people are in support of it, but when they get into specific situations, they may be against it. But for a lot of people listening, they may think, well, yeah, if I got diagnosed with Alzheimer's today, I might want to do that. I might not want to put my family through that down the line. So why is Alberta taking that other approach?
Uh, so the premier was asked directly on her radio show over the weekend. She didn't give a great response, I don't think. So she basically said, "Look, these are still, prohibited under the criminal code. We're not going to go beyond what Ottawa's doing, which
Mhm.
doesn't really make sense because Ottawa's had multiple years to challenge Quebec in court, to shut down what Quebec is doing with its advanced directive. It showed no appetite in doing so. So it's interesting that Danielle Smith seems to be deferring to, hey, these are still against the criminal code. Let's signify that here in Alberta. The rationale seems weird to me, especially given historically, how eager and gung ho she's been about asserting provincial rights. And then her Attorney General, Mickey Amory, was also asked about the advance requests during the media briefing. And he spoke vaguely of ethical and practical concerns about, okay, people in the later stages of dementia, they may not look like they're conscious, but potentially there's more going on that meets the eye. Do they consent at the moment MAID is administered? He also talked about, would advance requests preclude future breakthroughs? So if we have, stem cells or whatever it is that are game changers in treating Alzheimer's, are you already at that point far enough the path that you can't reverse an advance request? So again, I mean, this reasoning seems nebulous. Neither of them really wanted to talk about things like Alzheimer's too much. Both of them kind of
Mhm.
pivoted, when asked. I think to safer terrain for a lot of us, like depression or PTSD, and I think more clear cut. Okay, we need to help these folks. To answer your question, the advanced directives, sorry, the advanced requests were banned, will be banned under this bill, but we're not quite seeing a clear rationale.
Yeah, and I suppose it is. I can understand to some of the ethical considerations, and I know that the bill still has to be passed. It still has. There's potential for debate or amendments, and we'll see how that goes from here. But it is something that I know Canadians will be watching by and large as this issue unfolds in the country. Rahim, thanks very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.
10-3 is produced by Sean Knox. Theme music by Bryce Hall. Thanks to my guest Rahim Mohamed. More from him at nationalpost.com. I'm Dave Breakenridge. Thanks for listening.